In part 2 of chapter 1, we discussed two types of graphs, that is a pie chart and a bar graph that can be used to represent the distribution of a categorical variable. In the example here, we have the ages of moms of the first babies born in Morningside Hospital in a certain year. So the numbers that you see here are ages of moms in years. It's just a list of numbers. The variable here is ages of moms. That's the variable. It is a quantitative variable because age given in years is a numerical value for a measurement. So these numbers that you see here are raw data. Now the question is, who are the individuals in the above data set? So we've come across the word individuals. The individuals are the mothers of the first babies born in Morningside Hospital. So those are the individuals of interest here. Now the next question is, what are the variables? So the variable here, there's just one, is the age of mothers in years. Years is the unit. It's always important to mention the unit of measurement. And this is a quantitative variable. The next thing is to summarize this data set. We want to construct a distribution. If you remember, the distribution is the various values of the variable with the corresponding counts, or the word frequency is used instead of counts, listed in the form of a table. So that would be the distribution for the variable, and in this case the variable is the age of moms. So what we'll do now is summarize the raw data set. We'll go through the various steps. So the first step is figuring out the range of the data set. So pay attention to the word range here. So the range is a number that is calculated by subtracting the smallest number from the largest number. It's just the other way around. So it's the largest minus smallest. So 39 is the largest number. That's the age of a mom, 39 years, minus 15 years, which is the age of the youngest mom in this group. So the difference is 24. 24 is called the range of this data set. Next, we're going to divide this entire data set into about 5 subgroups or class intervals. So how do we do this? Let's take the range, which is a total of 24, divided by 5, because we want about 5 class intervals or bins. It is approximately equal to 5. So the size of each bin is about 5 years. So each bin will range from, let's say, 15 to 19 years, which is about 5 years, 20 to 24, which is another 5 years, 25 to 29, and so on. So what we've first done is divided the entire data set into about 5 age groups. The first one is 15 to 19. The second is 20 to 24, and so on. So we have 5 bins. For a data set about this size, 5 or 6 bins should be good enough. Now the next thing is we want to go in a systematic way and make sure that we are counting the number of moms that fall into each age group. So we start with, let's say, the first number 15. So we're looking at 15. 15 falls into the first age group. So we represent 15 by what is called a tally mark. So that's our first tally mark. Next, I move on to the number 29. 29 falls into the third age group, so I put a tally mark to represent 29. The next number is 20, so then it falls into the second age group, so then I put a tally mark to represent the age 20. So I keep going until I exhaust all the numbers in the raw data set, and finally this is what I get. So these are the tally marks. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 in the first bin or interval or age group. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's 5, and then there's 6. So we kind of put the fifth tally mark across the 4, so that way we form bundles of 5, so it's easy to count. So 5 plus 1 is 6. So we have 6 people in the age group of 20 to 24. In the age group of 25 through 29, we have 5 plus 1, 6 again. So the fifth tally mark goes across the first 4, so it forms a bundle of 5. In the age group of 30 to 34, we have 2. In the age group of 35 through 39, we have 2. So what we have now is a distribution of the variable, the quantitative variable, that is age. So these are the various values and these are the corresponding counts. For this variable, the count is 6. For this bin or subgroup or age group, the count is 6. For the fourth age group, the count is 2. So the first column along with the third column forms the distribution of the variable, that is age. Now in the previous slide, we summarized the data of age of moms of first babies born in Morningside Hospital. So now that we have summarized data, that is the distribution of the variable age of moms, we can represent that data set using what is called a histogram. Now this looks a lot like the bar graph, but notice that the variable here is not a categorical variable. The variable is quantitative. It's a measurement. So now the horizontal axis represents the age of moms. So there is no gap between the years because it goes from 15 to 20, 20 to 25, 25 to 30, 30 to 35, and 35 to 40. So there is no gap between the bars here. Now, I've used Crunchit to come up with this histogram. So the histogram has the quantitative variable on the horizontal axis and the counts on the vertical axis. So if you look at the first bar, so you look at the first rectangle, notice that the width of the rectangles is constant because each age group has about 5 years. It has 5 years exactly, so the width of the bars is exactly the same. So the base represents the age, the range of ages, that is 15 to 20, and the height represents the number of moms that fall into that age group. So the first bar tells us that in the age group of 15 to 20 years, there are 4 moms. In the age group of 20 to 25 years, which is the second bar, there are 6 moms, and so on. So even if we didn't have the distribution in front of us, the histogram that you see here, this graph is called a histogram, tells us exactly what you see in the distribution. It basically is a diagram that represents the distribution of the variable. Now when you look at the two graphs, that is a histogram and a bar graph, They look similar because you see rectangles. You see the x-axis, you see the y-axis, that is the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis. But they're very different. A histogram has a quantitative variable on the horizontal axis, and the bar graph has a categorical variable on the horizontal axis. Now, in a bar graph, you can see gaps between the bars, but in a histogram, you will not see. So this is a bar graph. Now, if you notice, the histogram has no gaps because the quantitative variable sits on the horizontal axis. Now let's just look at the histogram once again. We have the first bar, which represents the age group of 15 to 20. So there are 4 moms in that age group. There are 6 in the age group of 20 to 25, 6 in the age group of 25 to 30, 2 in the age group of 30 to 35, and 2 in the age group of 35 to 40. So the graph gives us a lot of information. We can clearly see that the age group 20 through 30 is more populated than the age groups of, for example, 30 to 35 or 35 to 40. So it gives us a lot of information without actually looking at the distribution or the raw data. Just the histogram tells us a lot about the data set that we are looking at. Now the histograms also give us the general pattern of the distribution. So the first pattern is the symmetric bell-shaped pattern. You've probably seen this in a lot of articles and different examples. So lots of variables fall into this symmetric bell-shaped pattern. So if you look at the overall pattern, that's what you see. For example, heights of people, weights of people, blood glucose levels, blood pressure readings. If you collect these variables from a large number of people, then you'll see that the histogram shows an overall pattern which looks like a bell. And this is also called a normal distribution. We're going to study this more in detail in chapter 11, but that's called a normal distribution. It's a symmetric bell-shaped distribution. Now, when you look at the second pattern, notice that this overall pattern has an extended tail on the left. So if you draw the histogram, the overall pattern will show that the left side of the bell seems to be extended. So this is not a symmetrical bell-shaped distribution. It looks like a bell, but it kind of drags to the left, and this is called a distribution that is skewed to the left. In the third example, you see a histogram that shows an overall pattern that extends to the right. So this is called a distribution with a right skew. So it's skewed to the right. Let's specifically look at the skewed distributions. Let's look at the distribution that has a skew to the left. Now think of this as a distribution of weights, for example. So if we divide it into 2 parts, so let's look at this portion of the distribution, and let's say that the weights range from 110 pounds to 220 pounds. So that forms a bell-shaped distribution, just that portion of the histogram. But what is it that's causing this extended tail on the left? Now, if you're thinking of this line as the x-axis, the numbers that are way to the left are numbers that are very, very small. So let's say this number is about 55 pounds. and up to maybe here there is about 80 pounds. Now notice that the bars in this portion of the distribution are short, which means there are few people, although they do exist, that have weights in the range 55 to 80 pounds. So that's the reason why the skew to the left is formed. So there are a bunch of numbers that are very small, and that's why the skew is to the left. Now, if you think about this last distribution, the skew is to the right. So by the same logic, you can see that this portion forms, if you just think about this portion of the distribution, it forms like a symmetrical bell shaped. But the extended tail to the right is formed by, and if you think about the bars of the histogram, they are short, but they do extend to the right, which means in the data set, there are lots of numbers that are very high and far removed from the rest of the data set, and that's what causes the skew to the right. So the skew to the right because of high numbers, and the skew to the left is because of low numbers. Think of the x-axis. The numbers get lower as we go to the left and get higher as we go to the right. Now, one more term that we need to know is related to the first distribution. Now, if you look at the first distribution, it is the symmetric bell-shaped distribution. Now, this looks like a little hill with a peak. There's just one peak. And this distribution is also called the unimodal. Uni for one, modal, so peak. So it's a unimodal distribution. Now, these are not the only types of distributions. We have many, many different types of distributions. For example, if we have a distribution that looks like this, what you notice here is that the distribution has two peaks, so it is called a bimodal distribution. Bi for two, modal distribution. Now this histogram represents the variable which is points scored on an exam. Now we've looked at three different shapes of distributions in the previous slide. One was the symmetric bell-shaped distribution, one was a distribution with a skew to the left, and the other was a distribution that had a skew to the right. Let's now look at this distribution and see what the overall pattern of this distribution is. So the first thing we have to look at is the general pattern. So let's just draw a shape around this histogram. So it goes up, peaks, and then falls, and then again we see another peak, and then again falls. Now this shape is a little different from the three distributions that we saw in the previous slide. It's not a symmetric bell-shaped distribution, but it looks like two symmetric bell-shaped distributions got joined together somewhere at this point. So it almost looks like there are two distributions sitting within the same set of data. Now, when we look at this graph, there are a lot of things that we can read from the graph without knowing the actual details. For example, we will be able to roughly answer this question: how many students are in this class? We may not be exact, but it is possible to answer this question, at least get a rough estimate. So how many students are in this class? So we can look at each rectangle, that is each rectangle in the histogram. Now, roughly speaking, the first rectangle represents the scores from 5 through 13, and that's on the x-axis, so the variable sits on the x-axis. And if we look at the height of the bar, we can kind of roughly say this is about 3 students who scored 5 through 15. Now when we look at 5 through 13, let's say 13, when we look at the second rectangle, that goes from 13 points to 21 points roughly. We don't have exact numbers because we're just making estimates here. And the number of students that fall into that range of scores is about, let's say, 7. We're looking at the third rectangle. The number of students that fall within the range of values 21 through 29 is about 15. And we can go from one rectangle to another, and we can estimate the number of students who fall into each range of values, and based on the height of the rectangle, we can figure out how many fall in that particular range of values. For example, this would be roughly 5. We could say this is about 1 student in that range of values, another 1 here, maybe about a 5 here, 6, 10, 3, and 3. So all the numbers that I have written on the top of rectangles in blue are the counts of the number of students that fall into each bin or each range of values of points scored on an exam. Now, this is a lot of information. So we can easily figure out the number of students in the class by adding up all these numbers, and it adds up to 59. So roughly the sample size n is equal to 59. Now we can always answer the question, how many students obtain scores between 0 and 50, in which case we just have to look at, just roughly speaking, just the first part of the distribution. So we've got two symmetric distributions attached together, so we're looking at the first part of it. And if we add up all the numbers that I'm just circling, that would give us the total number of students roughly that scored between 0 and 50. Overall, the range of scores would be starting from around 5, and that's just an estimate, to 93. So the range would be 93 minus 5, which is 88. So that's the overall range. So this number is called the range of the distribution. What is the shape of the distribution? Now we haven't come across an example of this sort of a distribution. This is called a bimodal distribution. I did mention this in the last slide. It's a bimodal distribution because it has 2 peaks. Now, why is it that, and this is an important question that can be answered, or at least we can take a guess at what the reason could be. Why is it that the distribution looks like 2 symmetrical distributions, bell-shaped distributions attached together? We can come up with reasons, although the picture doesn't tell us the story. We can kind of think about the reason why we have this sort of a distribution. The one thing that I can think of, and I'm sure you can come up with different reasons why there are 2 distributions here in the same group of students. I can think of the first group, let's call it group A, and the second group, let's call it group B. You could think of an exam that was given and the students had an option to study or not study for the exam. So it looks like Group A did not study. So there are students who did not study and maybe scored up to, let's say, 45 points. And maybe there's a second group of students, that is Group B, that actually studied for the exam. And their range of values or range of scores was from roughly about 50 to a 93.